So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we begin with a new text today. We just finished looking at Virginia Woolf's Solid Objects, which is a short story. We'll begin with a new short story today, which will also be the penultimate text, the second last text for this course, after which we'll move on to the final text. Now this particular story is called Toba Tek Singh by Sadat Hassan Manto. Now the original story is of course in Urdu, which is a language that Manto wrote in, and is primarily based on what is now Pakistan. So a lot of his fiction, a lot of his writings, they deal with partition, they deal with the trauma and the violence of partition. There are more graphic stories as well, but I chose this particular story because I think it resonates very well with the theme of this particular course, which is about consciousness, memory, and also how do you represent human interiority, the human thinking mind. That's been one of the common connecting points across the text, if you remember. So whether it's Ulysses by James Joyce, whether it's Catherine Mansfield's The Fly, whether it's Tagore's The Postmaster, this entire examination of interiority, the entire examination of imagination, of memory, and how all these things, they define and inform what we call identity, is something which modernism or 20th century fiction deals with quite extensively. So this story is very political, of course. It's a story about partition, but at the same time it's quite existential as well, very existential and very emotional. And in a way, it looks at the emotional qualities which inform the politics of identity formation, the politics of division, the politics of violence, the politics of classification. So if you take a look at the setting of the story, this is set in Lahore, and Lahore of course is in Pakistan now, and it suddenly became a Pakistani city after 1947, prior to which there was just one big landmass where people just existed together. There was no question of division. But with the partition, which is obviously a very violent event, as all of us know and aware of, with the partition, Lahore became a part of a different country, Pakistan, whereas in other parts of the landmass came to India, like Amritsar, for instance. Now, the unique thing about Lahore is what everyone expected at that point in time. Everyone expected Lahore to come to India and not go to Pakistan, because that was the cherry on the cake in a way. And the Indian leaders wanted it, the Pakistani leaders wanted it. So it was a bit of a contested category in terms of which way it will go, which country, which modern state will have Lahore. It was a very cosmopolitan state. It was a very, very cosmopolitan city, extremely vibrant, extremely cultural, and very, very multicultural, and very progressive in many ways. Right, so Lahore was obviously a very key thing, a very key space. So when Lahore went to Pakistan, it was contrary to much of popular expectations. At that point in time, Indian leaders, Indian sentiment, they wanted Lahore quite extensively. So the fact that this is set in Lahore is interesting because given that what I just told you, it should also be obvious that for a long time, people in Lahore did not feel the need to come to India because they thought they would go to India anyway. So Lahore became one of the most violent places in partition because it was a very, very delayed kind of movement which happened in Lahore, because for a long time people in Lahore, they thought they would go to India, and when it turned out that it's decided they would go to Pakistan, it would have been too late by then to shift and migrate, and in the process many of them were subjected to violence and trauma. Now, the other important thing about the story is it's set in an asylum, a madhouse in Lahore, and that immediately becomes a very political space. It becomes, in a way, a biopolitical space, because the madhouse, in a way, traditionally, classically, if you read Foucault, the history of madness, etc., or the archaeology of knowledge, or madness of civilization, we find that a madhouse always becomes a space of a lot of discursive apparatus, medicine being one of them, control and coercion being one of them. And we've already seen a little bit of this in Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, if you remember, the entire idea of Septimus Smith being a malingerer, being someone who's just feigning to have a disease, some mental illness which is not really a disease. Now that perspective, the very hardcore materialist medical perspective, was taken by the then neurologists at the time, which in a way contributed to Septimus's trauma and demise and sensory alienation and eventual demise. Something similar happens here as well. It's a madhouse, but we find that the madhouse suddenly becomes a very discursive space because the mad people are not really the normative citizens. So they're the ones who have been away from the mainstream movements. So some of them are not even aware of partition. It's like a Rip Van Winkle situation where just suddenly they wake up and a civil war has happened and the country is divided. So something similar happens here as well, where the madmen just suddenly are told that there's a partition, there's a divide which is taking place, and now there will be some rational classifications, rational reclassifications. Now, what it immediately brings to the fore is the entire absurdity of bureaucracy, the entire absurdity of political rationality and political rationale, and how the Madhouse, or the madmen in the Madhouse, ironically or paradoxically, they turn out to be asking more fundamental questions which are more rational, more sane, and definitely more human in quality, right? So the entire idea of rationality and irrationality, the entire dichotomy of the binary, sort of turn on its head, if you will. Right, so the Madhouse becomes a discursive space. The Madhouse becomes a space of some kind of resistance because the madmen, they refuse to go to India or Pakistan, and you find that because they're not really in the loop or not really switched on about the political movements and the political changes, most of them couldn't care less about India or Pakistan. They just want to go back to their homes in some village, in some city, in some town, which doesn't exist. Now, Toba Tek Singh is the name of one such village. And interestingly, what you find in the story is this village just disappears from the map, which brings us to the other point which is interesting for the story, the entire politics of producing maps. Map making, as you all know, is a very political activity. So when you make a map, you're including certain territories, but equally, you're excluding certain territories. So map making has a liminal inclusion-exclusion quality about it already. The idea of map making is akin structurally as well as sentimentally to the idea of representation. Now, when you represent something, there are certain bits which get accentuated, there are certain bits which get highlighted, there are certain bits which get included. But equally, there are certain other bits which get erased or unaccentuated or non-highlighted or just they disappear from the order of representation. So likewise, map making, when you draw a map, you're including certain territories, but equally, you're excluding certain other territories. Now, Toba Tek Singh, that village where the character Bishan Singh comes from, the protagonist Bishan Singh comes from, is one such territory. It becomes a no space, it becomes a no man's land. And I'll come back to the idea of no man's land later. It's a very symbolic space which will appear again in the story. So Toba Tek Singh quite literally becomes a no man's land. It's a no land, a no place, which interestingly or paradoxically makes it utopian in quality. Because the entire idea of utopia, if you take a look at the word etymologically, utopia, was nowhere, and topos is land, or topography, or landmass. So utopia is literally speaking, it means no land. In other words, no land is perfect, but is that perfect land in your mind, which doesn't really exist in the map? So there is a utopian quality about Toba Tek Singh, that village, which is nowhere to be found. But also, Toba Tek Singh becomes a very real reminder of how these spatial classifications are done in such an absurd manner to the extent that certain spaces get erased completely from human imagination. They get erased completely from the map-making imagination, where you make a map but you don't include certain things, certain spaces, so those are effectively erased away. Right? So Toba Tek Singh is also an erasure of space, which in a way contributes towards an erasure of identity. And the madmen's attempt to claim their space back, the madmen's attempt to reclaim it, to reassert it, and to actually demand for that space becomes, very ironically, the only sane subversive model available, or the only sane model of subversion available at this point of time. So sanity and subversion, insanity and confirmation, they all become very complex categories in the story, right? So we find that this is, like I mentioned, this is a story which happens right after the partition in 1947, maybe 2 or 3 years later, where the story begins with bureaucratic decisions among the top officials in each country, where suddenly they realize there are some Hindus who are left behind in Pakistan, and there are some Muslims who want to come back to Pakistan, perhaps. They should also be allowed to do it. So there'll be like an exchange of madmen across the borders, which the very spectacle of which it highlights or accentuates or foregrounds the absurdity. But the real absurdity is obviously the key question about partition in the first place. So the obvious question that comes up in the story is the very act of partition, the very activity, the very decision of partition, the very exercise of partition, that itself is a very, very absurd activity. So the whole idea of absurdity and rationality are you're almost going to invert it in some sense, because like I mentioned, the madman's response to the entire idea of two countries, that turns out to be probably the most sane response, the most commonsensical, the most rational response, where they tell each other we don't really want to go to India or Pakistan. We couldn't care less about the two nation states. What about our homes? What about the village that we grew up in? So, that is the aspiration. That's the nostalgia. There's no nostalgia. There's no national nostalgia. Now, what that also tells us is that the whole idea of nation as a political construct is essentially a Western import. It's imported from the Western political system, the whole idea of the nation state. Because prior to this, there was no such nation state in India. I mean, India was obviously different kingdoms, different villages, different towns, different dynasties. But the whole idea of nation as one country coming together with a constitution, with a standard legal system, is a post-colonial phenomenon, it's a post-imperial phenomenon, right? So Toba Tek Singh, in a way, this story may be read as a refusal to subscribe to the idea of the nation state, as a refusal to subscribe to the idea of a national citizenship. And obviously we are now, even in a country today, there's a lot of complex questions about citizenship that we have to have a very nuanced understanding. But this story too, and the reason why it resonates with us even today is because it talks about some very fundamental human emotion. One obvious emotion is alienation. The fact that you're emotionally alienated because of a cultural or political decision which takes place somewhere else, where you have no access to, where you have no agency towards. And this whole idea of agency-lessness becomes important as well, because decisions are made for you, decisions are made about you, never with you, right? So the whole idea of staying away, or forcibly staying away, or someone's actually asking you to stay away, are not really participating in a decision-making process, while at the same time being subjected to the outcomes of those decisions makes the story really a story about human helplessness or human agency-lessness at a time of political crisis, at a time of political totalitarianism, right? So this is the setting in the story. And of course, as you move on, we find out some of the more nuances, especially the way the story ends is very, very interesting. This may be familiar to many of you. You may have read this at different times or different situations. But what I want to do in this case, and the reason why I've chosen this text, is because I want to make it connect with some of the other modernist texts we have done so far, where the question of agency, memory, nostalgia, and affect or affective identities become very, very important. Right? Identities which rely on affect, identities which are produced by affect. The affect could be one of nostalgia, the affect could be one of mourning, the affect could be about happiness. But in either way, the affective production of identities is something that Toba Tek Singh really excels in as a short story. Right, so with that preamble in mind, let's begin the story. Let's dive right into the text. So this is Toba Tek Singh by Siddharth Hassan Mante, which should be on your screen. Okay, so here we begin. 2 or 3 years after the 1947 partition, it occurred to the governments of India and Pakistan to exchange their lunatics in the same manner as it exchanged their criminals. Again, look at the conjoining of criminals and lunatics. The interesting thing is these are not really alleged citizens. So, criminals are dissenters, lunatics are madmen. So none of these two categories does subscribe to the normative category of citizenship, right? So they don't really belong to that normative map as such. So it was decided that the madmen and the criminals were put together and exchanged, as per the rationale, the religious rationale, which caused the partition. So we find that this entire statement, the very opening, which appears to be very, very objective, which appears to be very detached, it's actually packed with irony, it's packed with sarcasm, it's packed with a very biting, satirical intent. The Muslim lunatics in India were to be sent over to Pakistan, and the Hindu and Sikh lunatics in Pakistani asylums were to be handed over to India. So the Hindu and the Sikh lunatics in Pakistan would be coming to India, and the Muslim lunatics in Pakistan, they wanted to, they'll go back to India, to Pakistan. Right, so again, this religious, very reductionist religious rationale, which is used to describe this decision of crossover according to your religious affiliations and religious affinities. It was difficult to say whether the proposal made any sense or not. However, the decision had been taken at the topmost level on both sides. After high-level conferences were held a day, was fixed for exchange of the lunatics. It was agreed that those Muslim lunatics who had families in India would be permitted to stay back while the rest would be escorted to the borders. Since almost all the Hindu and Muslims have migrated from Pakistan, the question of retaining non-Muslim lunatics in Pakistan did not arise. All of them were to be taken to India. So again, look at the impassionate, almost detached tone of the journalistic tone of this narrator over here. Now, The other thing we find about the story is this Kafkaesque quality, this bizarre, irrational quality, which is very Kafkaesque. Now, we are told that there is some decision-making body on either side of the government who had some closed-door meetings, some closed-door conferences, some closed-door decisions, which had obviously nothing to do with the agency and the will of the people. No one really asked these madmen what they wanted. That was obviously out of question. No consensus was taken, no voting was done. So this is the irony, the fact that these are two democratic nations, but the way they treat their dissenting citizens like madmen and criminals, the decisions are taken just for them, about them, without any consultation whatsoever. So it was many conferences were held, many top-level meetings were held and organized bureaucratically, and then was decided to swap it according to some rationale. So the Muslim lunatics in India who had families in Pakistan would be shipped back to Pakistan, whereas the Hindus and the Sikh lunatics in Pakistan would be sent back to India. So that was a decision taken after a lot of top-level closed-door conferences. And the top-level closed-door quality is obviously meant to be something like an ivory tower from which the common people, to which the common people has no access whatsoever. So people have no access to the ivory tower. At the same time, their lives are getting affected by the decisions taken in some closed-door conferences. So again, this complete break from the people and the political will, or the political party, or the political muscle, this complete rupture, this complete departure from these two categories makes it a very, very dystopian kind of a setting. The fact that the people have absolutely no access or no will or no agency in terms of determining what they want, right? So what is good for them. Okay, so nobody knew what transpired in India, but so far as Pakistan was concerned, this news created quite a stir in the lunatic asylum at Lahore, leading to all sorts of funny developments. A Muslim lunatic, a regular leader of the fiery Urdu daily Zamindar, when asked where Pakistan was, reflected for a while and replied, "Don't you know, a place in India known for manufacturing cut-throat razors." Apparently satisfied, the friend asks no more questions. So again, these irrational, bizarre questions which are superficially funny and quality, they actually have a dark quality as well, a darker, deeper quality. Because this question about where is Pakistan and the response, there is a place where razors are made, while being completely irrational, it also highlights the irrationality and absurdity of the partition itself in the first place. The whole point is, where is Pakistan? Where is the need to divide two countries which had historically been divide one big landmass and one big community of people who have historically lived together for so many centuries. So that question obviously is not asked over here. Whereas what gets asked are those trivial questions, those seemingly meaningless questions, which in a way throw light on the question which is not asked. So again, we find that how absences play a very key role here as well. Something we keep seeing in modernism, that absences play a very key role. What is not said, what is not asked, sometimes become way more important than what actually eventually gets asked. Okay, likewise, a Sikh lunatic asks another Sikh, "Sadaji, why are we being deported to India? We don't even know the language." The Sikh gave a knowing smile, "But I know the language of Hindustaras." He replied, "Those bloody Indians, the way they strut about." So again, look at the way in which someone who's a Sikh, who's notionally supposed to be an Indian, is being very, very critical of Indians, is very, very, passing all these disparaging remarks about India in the first place. And also, this non-knowledge about the language becomes important. So the conversation, it sort of hovers around the idea of language. What are we going to do in India? We don't even know the language. Well, the response is, "Oh, I know Hindustani," and then Hindustaras, and then there's this offensive, very critical and sarcastic comment about knowing how Indians strut about, this bloody Indians, how they strut about. So this would appear racist and imperial discourse, but then this is said by notionally an Indian, or suppose someone is supposed to be an Indian, or someone is about to be an Indian, a Sikh madman. One day while taking a bath, his bath, a Muslim lunatic yelled, "Pakistan Zindabad," with such force that it slipped, fell down on the floor, and was knocked unconscious. Again, this dark comic qualities, the dark comic images are important in the story. There's someone, a madman, a Muslim madman, who just yelled and screamed, "Long live Pakistan, Zindabad," is long live. Long live Pakistan. To a certain extent, he got so pumped up, so enthusiastic, that slipped on the floor and was knocked unconscious. So again, it's almost like a tipping point of energy. You just get consumed by the propaganda, and you consume the propaganda to the extent that it becomes too hard to handle, it becomes too vibrant to handle, it becomes too complex to handle. And then something else happens. There's almost a cathartic release where you say, "Long live Pakistan," because you bought that idea of Pakistan to the extent that it makes you unconscious and you fall down on the floor. Now comes the interesting bit where you look at the demography inside the madhouse. We get to know that no, all these people are actually mad. There's some pretending to be mad because they are otherwise criminals, and of course if you can medicalize a crime, then the statement becomes, or the punishment becomes less severe, because then you have a logical medical reason to behave in a way that you did, and this is what we get to know from here. Not all the lunatics were insane. Quite a few of them were murderous. To escape the gallows, the relatives had gotten them in by bribing the officials. So, because they have been murderers and they would normally be hanged to death, but the relatives have somehow put them inside the madman by getting presumably fake medical certificates and delivering those to the officials. Now, they had only a vague idea about the division of India or what Pakistan was. They were utterly ignorant of the present situation. Newspapers hardly ever gave the true picture, and the asylum watchers were illiterates from whose conversation they could not glean anything. So again, look at the cut-off quality of this asylum. It's in Lahore, which is obviously a very cosmopolitan, multicultural, connected city. But the fact that it's a discursive space, the madhouse is a discursive space, also makes it insular to information. And the insularity of information is important. They don't have any knowledge at all. They sometimes read newspapers which come to them periodically, but even that gives a very unclear knowledge. So, and they want to engage with the guards, these madmen inside, or the criminals who pretend to be madmen. So they want to exchange with the guards, but their guards wouldn't know much either. So this implies, among other things over here, what is also the alienation is also epistemic alienation, in the sense that this is entirely about the non-availability of any knowledge, or any palpable knowledge, or any concrete knowledge, right? So they could glean nothing. All that these inmates knew was that there was a man named Quaid-e-Azam who had set up a separate state for Muslims called Pakistan, but they had no idea where Pakistan was. That was why they were all at a loss whether they were now in India or in Pakistan. If they were in India, then where was Pakistan? If they were in Pakistan, then how come only a short while ago they were in India? How could they be in India a short while ago and now suddenly in Pakistan? Now, all these questions, again, which appear absurd, but what they actually suggest is the porous quality about borders. The fact that you can be in India in the morning, at the same time you can be in Pakistan in the evening, well, all it takes is one bureaucratic decision. All it takes is a renaming of certain names of certain places. So, among other things, Toba Tek Singh is also about the plasticity of identity formation, the plasticity of nationalist identity formation, right? So these questions, if this is India, then, how come, suddenly this is Pakistan, and this is Pakistan, how come this is India? So, all these, again, seemingly absurd questions are actually very, very rational questions. So the madmen are actually asking everyone, well, if you say this is Pakistan, then how come this is India in the first place? And if you say it is India, then how come everyone says this is in Pakistan? Right? So, and more importantly, where is Pakistan? They have no idea where Pakistan is. Obviously, it's a newer country, it's a newer phenomenon, it's a newer construct, but then they have no knowledge about the constructed quality of Pakistan, or the event through which Pakistan had been constructed. Okay, one of the lunatics got so bewildered with his India rigmarole that one day, while sweeping the floor, he climbed up the tree and, sitting on the branch, harangued the people below for 2 hours on end about the delicate problems of India and Pakistan. So again, look at the different acts of insanity over here, which again, in a way, throws a very complex light on the rational, sane decisions about nation-making and nation divisions. So this person, one of the lunatics, had climbed up a tree and started, talking to people, haranguing people who were passing by the tree for the next 2 hours endlessly. When the guards asked him to come down, he climbed up still higher and said, I don't want to live in India and Pakistan. I'm going to make my home right here on the street. So again, look at the seeming absurdity in the sentence. I don't want to go to India, I don't want to go to Pakistan, I want to live in the street forever. Obviously, this is irrational, absurd, a madman's rant. But at the same time, it has some very key features which are interesting for the story. Now, what if a person doesn't want to go to India, doesn't want to go to Pakistan, but just wants to go back to his village where he grew up? Is that option available to him? Perhaps not. So we have these two different narratives which are being formed. So it's almost like two national narratives which are being formed. Or if you just push it further into a metafictional thing, two plots are being written, two plots are being constructed. Now, would you rather be a character in plot A, or would you rather be a character in plot B? So two new narratives are being formed. It's a very, this is obviously a formative phase of the two narratives. So now they want all the classifications to take place in a safe way. So the madman and the Muslim madman should go to India, Pakistan, and the Hindu madman should come to India, right? So all these classifications become more and more cut and dried. Now Now, obviously, the people over here, they couldn't care less about Pakistan or India. They just want to go back to their own village, and their own identity is from that particular village. So we find how these constructs are so new in quality, so recent in quality. The construct of India and the construct of Pakistan over here. The oldest hubbub affected a radio engineer with an MSc degree, a Muslim, a quiet man who took long walks by himself. One day he stripped off all his clothes, gave them to a guard, and ran in a garden stark naked. So again, this whole idea of taking off the clothes and giving to a guard and running around naked becomes obviously an act of insanity, but the purposelessness of this act is also a pointer to the purposelessness of the partition in the first place. Another Muslim inmate from Chiniyat, an erstwhile adherent of the Muslim League, who bathed 15 or 16 times a day, suddenly gave up bathing. And his name was Muhammad Ali. He one day proclaimed that he was none other than the Quadi-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Taking a cue for him, a Sikh announced that he was Master Tara Singh, the leader of the Sikhs. This could have led to open violence, but before any harm could be done, the two lunatics were declared dangerous and locked up in a separate cell. So again, look at the way in which this cultural consumption takes place. There are lunatics also, some of them are also consuming this normative narrative about the Hindu India and the Muslim Pakistan, right? So one of them, they claim that he is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and obviously Muhammad Ali Jinnah is an iconic figure in Pakistan history because he was one of the pioneers. He's one of the game makers during the partition time, the partition epoch, just like Nehru was for India, right? So he claims himself to be Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, interestingly, this also produces a paradoxical effect on a Sikh, who now goes on to say that I am Master Tara Singh. So Tara Singh obviously being a Sikh leader, a Sikh guru, and that becomes important. So again, look at the way in which identity formations are seemingly absurdly done. But beneath the absurdity, we have a critique of the seeming rationality which had formed the partition in the first place. And that's something which will keep coming up over and over again. So I'll stop at this point today. We'll continue with this lecture in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.